was a cool February morning in Los Angeles, the kind where the sky is pale blue and the air smells faintly of eucalyptus and damp concrete from last night's rain. Inside a modest studio tucked away in a quiet corner of the city, two men were about to sit down for a conversation that would later ripple across the internet, not because of explosions or scandals, but because of something far quieter, far more human. One of them was Joe Rogan. By 2019, his podcast had become a cultural phenomenon. People tuned in not just for the jokes or the wild theories, but because Joe had a rare gift. He could make almost anyone feel comfortable enough to drop their guard. He wasn't slick or rehearsed. He wore the same plain t-shirt every episode, drank tea from a chipped mug, and asked questions like a curious friend rather than a journalist chasing a headline. The other man was Keanu Reeves. At first glance, he didn't seem like the podcast type. He rarely gave interviews. He avoided red carpets when he could. He never posted on social media. And yet, here he was, walking into the studio with a small backpack slung over one shoulder, wearing a black shirt, jeans, and a pair of well-worn boots. He smiled softly when Joe greeted him, shook his hand firmly, and sat down without fanfare. No entourage, no publicist hovering nearby, just him. They'd met before briefly, once at a martial arts seminar, another time backstage at a UFC event. But this was different. This was intentional. Keanu had agreed to come on the show not to plug a movie, though he did have one coming out, but because he'd heard Joe was someone who actually listened. And Keanu, for all his fame, had spent much of his life feeling unheard, not because people didn't speak to him, but because they often spoke to the idea of him, not the real person underneath. As the mics were checked and the lights dimmed just enough to feel cozy, the two settled in. There was no audience, no clapping, no pressure, just two chairs, a table with water bottles and tea, and the low hum of the city outside. Joe leaned back, relaxed, and said, "Man, I've wanted to talk to you for years. Like, seriously. You're one of those people everyone thinks they know, but I don't think anyone really does." Keanu chuckled softly, a quiet sound that seemed to come from deep in his chest. "I don't know," he said. "I think I'm pretty simple." But Joe shook his head. "Nah, you're not simple. You're just quiet about the complicated parts." And with that, the conversation began. Not with movie trivia or box office numbers, but with life. They talked about motorcycles first because both loved them. Keanu had been riding since he was a teenager, and he still fixed his own bikes. He described the feeling of being on an open road at dawn, how the engine's rumble matched his heartbeat, how the wind cleared his mind better than any meditation app ever could. Joe nodded like he understood completely, because he did. He'd spent years on the road too, first as a stand-up comic sleeping in his car, then as a fighter, then as a podcaster chasing truth in long, winding talks. From bikes, they drifted to discipline. Keanu had trained in martial arts for decades, not for roles, but because he believed in the practice itself. The repetition, the respect, the way it taught you to stay calm when everything around you was chaos. He spoke about his instructors like they were family, about how they'd corrected his stance not with anger but with patience. "It's not about being the best," he said. "It's about showing up. Every day, even when you don't feel like it." Joe listened, really listened. He didn't interrupt to make a joke or pivot to his own story. He let the silence sit when it needed to, and that's what made Keanu open up more. Slowly, carefully, like someone testing the ice before stepping onto a frozen lake. They talked about acting, not the glamour but the loneliness of it. How you spend months pretending to be someone else. Then suddenly you're back in your own skin and it feels strange. Keanu admitted that sometimes after wrapping a film, he'd go days without speaking to anyone, not because he was depressed, but because he needed to remember who he was outside of the character. "You lose yourself a little," he said quietly, "and you have to find your way back." Joe asked if fame ever felt like a cage. Keanu thought about it for a long moment. "Not a cage," he finally said. "More like a mirror that's always on. People see you, but they see what they want to see. The hero, the sad guy, the nice guy, but not you. Just the version they made up." There was a sadness in his voice, but not bitterness. It was the kind of sadness that comes from years of being misunderstood, yet choosing kindness anyway. That's what so many people didn't get about him. His kindness wasn't an act. It was a choice he made again and again, even when the world gave him every reason to be cold. As the conversation flowed, something remarkable happened. The usual celebrity distance vanished. This wasn't an interview. It was a real talk between two human beings who'd both seen pain, who'd both lost people, who both knew what it meant to keep going when it would have been easier to stop. Joe, for all his loud energy, had his own quiet battles. Health scares, public missteps, the weight of being constantly watched and judged. And Keanu, for all his calm, carried grief like a second shadow. But in that studio, none of that mattered. What mattered was the space between them, the trust forming in real time. Keanu started to relax. His shoulders dropped. He laughed a little more. He even made a dry joke about how he still didn't understand how smartphones worked. And Joe cracked up like it was the funniest thing he'd heard all week. Time slipped by. An hour, then 2. The sun moved across the floor. Outside, traffic hummed. Inside, 2 men talked about death, love, purpose, and what it means to live well. They weren't performing. They weren't selling anything. They were just present, and that's what made what came next so powerful. Because when Joe finally asked that one simple question, a question so ordinary it could have been asked over coffee at a diner, it landed like a stone in still water. Not because it was shocking, but because it was true. And truth, especially when it's been buried for years, has a way of shaking even the steadiest person. But that moment was still coming. For now, in this quiet room, there was just conversation, just 2 people being human, and sometimes that's enough to change everything. The conversation had been flowing like a slow river, calm, deep, and steady. They'd talked about motorcycles, martial arts, the strange loneliness of being known by millions yet truly known by almost no one. Laughter had come easy. Silence had felt comfortable, not awkward. Joe leaned back in his chair, swirling the last bit of tea in his mug, watching the steam curl into the air. Keanu sat across from him, hands resting loosely on his knees, eyes calm but distant like he was watching something far beyond the walls of the studio. Then Joe shifted slightly. Not dramatically, just a small movement, the kind you make when you're about to say something that matters. He didn't look at his notes. There were no notes. He just looked at Keanu, really looked at him and asked, "Do you ever think about your daughter?" The words hung in the air like dust motes in sunlight, tiny, weightless, but impossible to ignore. For a heartbeat, nothing changed. Keanu didn't flinch. He didn't look away. But something inside him did shift, like a door creaking open in a house that's been locked for years. His breathing slowed. His shoulders, which had finally relaxed after hours of easy talk, tensed almost imperceptibly. He looked down at his hands, then back up, and when he spoke, his voice was softer than before, quieter, like he was speaking not to Joe, but to a memory. "Every day," he said. Just 2 words, but they carried a lifetime. Joe didn't react with shock or pity. He didn't jump in with a follow-up question or try to lighten the mood. He just nodded slowly, giving the words room to breathe. Because he understood, this wasn't gossip. This wasn't a story to be mined for clicks. This was grief, real, raw, and still alive after all these years. Keanu took a breath, then another. And then carefully, like someone stepping onto thin ice, he began to speak, not in grand declarations, but in fragments and truths that had been tucked away for so long they'd almost turned to stone. He talked about how she was supposed to be born in December 1999, how he and the woman he loved had painted the nursery pale yellow, hung up tiny stars on the ceiling, bought a rocking chair that squeaked just a little when you leaned back too far. He remembered feeling nervous but excited, like most first-time parents. He'd read books, asked older friends for advice, even practiced changing diapers on a pillow. He wanted to be ready, but she never came home. She was stillborn, full term but gone before she ever took a breath. He said it plainly without drama, but the pain was there, in the way his voice cracked on the word stillborn, in the way his fingers curled slightly around the edge of his jeans. He didn't say much about the days that followed. He didn't need to. Anyone who's lost someone knows that part. The numbness, the disbelief, the way the world keeps turning even when your whole universe has stopped. He did say that he held her just once, long enough to memorize the shape of her face, the weight of her in his arms, the silence where her cry should have been. Then, as if the universe wasn't done testing him, Tragedy struck again, just 18 months later. The woman he loved, the mother of his child, died in a car crash. One moment she was there, the next she was gone. 2 losses, back to back, like waves crashing over someone already drowning. Keanu didn't cry. Not then. But his eyes glistened, and his voice grew even quieter, like he was afraid that if he spoke too loudly, the memories might shatter. He said that for a long time he didn't know how to keep going. Not in a dramatic way, no breakdowns, no headlines, but in the quiet daily struggle of getting out of bed, of facing a world that felt hollow. He started visiting their graves. Not on anniversaries or birthdays, but randomly, on Tuesdays, on rainy afternoons, sometimes late at night. He'd sit on the grass, talk to them like they were still there, tell them about his day, about the movies he was making, about the stray cat he'd adopted. He didn't expect answers. He just needed to feel connected, to remind himself that love doesn't end just because someone's gone. Joe listened without interrupting. He didn't offer empty platitudes like, everything happens for a reason or she's in a better place. He knew those words, however well-meaning, often feel like salt in a wound. Instead, he stayed present. He made eye contact, he nodded. He let the silence sit when it needed to. After a while, Keanu looked up and gave a small, sad smile. People think I'm strong, he said, but most days I'm just trying not to fall apart. That line hit hard, not because it was poetic, but because it was honest. And in a world full of curated images and perfect Instagram lives, honesty like that is rare, especially from someone who spent decades in the spotlight, expected to be the hero, the stoic, the forever chill guy who never shows pain. But here he was, showing it. Not for sympathy, not for attention, but because Joe had asked a real question, and he'd decided to give a real answer. What made the moment even more powerful was what didn't happen. There was no music swelling in the background, no dramatic close-up, no viral soundbite being crafted for TikTok. It was just 2 men in a quiet room sharing something deeply human, and that's what made it unforgettable. Later, people would replay that part of the podcast over and over, not because it was shocking, but because it felt like a permission slip. A reminder that it's okay to carry grief, that you don't have to get over it, that love and loss can live side by side for the rest of your life, and that's not weakness. That's being human. Joe finally spoke again, his voice gentle. I'm really sorry, he said. Not I can't imagine, because he knew no one truly can. Just I'm sorry, and that was enough. Keanu nodded. Thank you, he said. And then slowly he exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for 20 years. The conversation didn't end there. They kept talking. About resilience, about finding meaning, about how pain can change you but doesn't have to destroy you. But everything after that question felt different. Lighter somehow, even though the subject was heavy, because something had been released. A truth had been spoken out loud, and in doing so it lost a little of its power to hurt. As the minutes passed, Keanu's posture softened again. His voice regained some of its usual calm. He even managed a small laugh when Joe joked about how hard it is to explain emotions to guys who grew up thinking crying is weakness. Yes, Keanu said with a half smile. We're all just faking it till we make it, but everyone listening knew he wasn't faking. Not this, and that's why this moment would stay with people. Not because it was traumatic in a sensational way, but because it was real. Because it showed that even the calmest people carry storms inside them. And sometimes all it takes is one simple question, asked with kindness, not curiosity, to let a little light in. After that question, so simple, so heavy, the air in the room changed. It wasn't sad exactly, more like clear, like a storm had passed through and left everything washed clean. Keanu didn't collapse. He didn't shut down, but something in him had shifted, like a stone finally rolling free after years of being stuck in place. He kept talking, not in long speeches, but in quiet reflections, each one honest, each one carrying the weight of someone who'd walked through fire and come out the other side, not unscathed, but still standing. He spoke about how grief doesn't announce itself with sirens. It doesn't always show up on anniversaries or holidays. Sometimes it hits you in the middle of the cereal aisle when you see a box your child would have loved, or when you hear a certain song in a coffee shop. Or when you catch your own reflection in a window and wonder how you're still here when they're not. It's not loud, he said. It's just always there. Like background noise you learn to live with, Joe nodded. He'd lost people too. Friends, family. And he knew that kind of quiet ache. He asked if Keanu ever got angry. Not at God or the universe, but just angry. At the unfairness of it all. Keanu thought for a long moment. Yeah, he admitted, I did. For a while I was furious. Not at anyone specific, just at life. Like, why her? Why them? Why me? He paused, then added, but anger doesn't bring them back. And holding on to it, it just makes the hole bigger. So he made a choice, not all at once, but slowly over years. He chose to remember the love, not just the loss. He started focusing on the time he did have. The laughter, the plans, the way she'd smile when she talked about becoming a mom. She was so excited, he said softly. She had names picked out, songs she wanted to play for the baby. She believed in joy. And so he decided he would too. That didn't mean pretending everything was fine. It meant carrying both, the sorrow and the love at the same time. Like holding two stones in your hands, one heavy, one warm, and walking forward anyway. He talked about how he began helping others. Not for praise, but because it helped him feel connected to something bigger than his own pain. He'd visit children's hospitals quietly. No cameras, no fanfare. He'd sit with kids going through chemo, tell them stories, listen to their fears. He donated millions to cancer research and leukemia foundations. Never publicly, never for credit. People only found out years later, through old receipts or offhand comments from nurses who remembered a kind man in a baseball cap who stayed long after visiting hours. Helping doesn't fix it, he said, but it reminds you that you're not alone, and that your pain can mean something if you let it. Joe asked if he ever felt guilty for being happy again. That's a question a lot of people carry after loss, like, joy is a betrayal. Keanu's eyes softened. All the time, he said, especially in the beginning. If I laughed at a movie or enjoyed a meal, I'd feel like I was forgetting them, like I was moving on without them. But over time, he realized something important. They wouldn't want me to suffer forever. She loved life. She'd want me to live mine. That idea, that love continues even after death, became his anchor. He didn't move on. He moved forward, carrying them with him. As he spoke, his voice never rose. There were no dramatic pauses for effect. Just steady, quiet truth, and that's what made it powerful. In a world full of noise, of outrage, of performance, of people shouting to be heard, this was the opposite. This was someone choosing to speak softly, because the words mattered more than the volume. Joe, for his part, didn't try to fix anything. He didn't offer advice or pivot to a lighter topic. He just stayed with him in the feeling. That's a rare gift, to sit with someone in their pain without trying to pull them out of it. Sometimes the greatest kindness is just saying, I see you, I hear you, you don't have to pretend. Later, when people listened to this part of the podcast, many said it was the first time they'd heard a man talk about grief like this, not as weakness, but as part of being human. No macho posturing. No, I'm fine, just honesty. And in that honesty, others found permission to feel their own pain without shame. One listener, a father who'd lost his son in a car accident, wrote in saying he'd carried guilt for 10 years because he couldn't cry in front of his wife. Hearing Keanu say, I'm just trying not to fall apart, made him finally break down and then finally start healing. Another person, a young woman who'd lost her mother to cancer, said she played that segment on repeat during her darkest nights. Not because it made her feel better, but because it made her feel less alone. That's the thing about real talk, it ripples. It doesn't stay in the room where it was spoken. It travels. It finds people in their quiet moments and whispers, you're not broken, you're just human. Back in the studio, the conversation began to shift again, not away from pain, but toward hope. Not the shiny, fake kind of hope sold in self-help books, but the gritty, everyday kind. The kind that shows up when you get out of bed even though you don't want to. When you choose kindness even when the world feels cruel. When you remember someone you lost not with tears alone, but with a smile for the joy they brought you. Keanu talked about how he started finding beauty in small things again. The way sunlight hits a wet sidewalk, the sound of rain on a tin roof, the smell of old books. After everything, he said, I realized life is made of these tiny moments. And if you miss them because you're stuck in the past, you miss living. He didn't say it like a quote for a poster. He said it like someone who'd almost missed it himself and was grateful he hadn't. Joe asked if he believed in an afterlife. Keanu smiled faintly. I don't know, he said. But I like to think love doesn't just disappear. Energy can't be destroyed, right? So maybe love is still out there somewhere, and that's enough for me. There was no dogma in his words, no certainty, just a gentle hope, held lightly. As the hours passed, the tension that had settled in Keanu's shoulders after that question began to ease. Not because the pain was gone, it never really is, but because he'd shared it. And in sharing, it became a little lighter, like setting down a backpack you've carried for 20 years and realizing you don't have to carry it alone anymore. When they finally wrapped up the recording, neither man rushed to leave. They sat for a few extra minutes in comfortable silence, sipping cold tea, the kind of quiet that only exists between people who've just been real with each other. Joe reached out and put a hand on Keanu's shoulder. Thank you, he said. Not for the interview, not for the content, just thank you. Keanu looked at him and nodded. Thank you for asking. And in that moment, something important happened, not just for them, but for everyone who would later hear those words. A reminder that we don't have to hide our wounds to be strong, that asking about someone's pain isn't rude, it's an act of care, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply say, tell me about them, because in the telling, we honor what was lost, and in the listening, we give each other the courage to keep going. When the podcast episode went live, nobody expected what happened next. It wasn't promoted with flashy trailers or social media countdowns. There was no press release. Just a quiet upload on a Tuesday morning like any other episode. But within hours, something unusual began to unfold. People weren't just listening, they were sharing. Not clips of jokes or wild theories, but that one quiet moment. The question, the answer, the silence that followed. At first, it spread through small corners of the internet, Reddit threads, private Facebook groups for grieving parents, forums where people talked about mental health late at night. Someone would post, "Did you hear what he said about his daughter?" And others would reply with their own stories. A woman who lost her baby at 22 weeks wrote, "I've never heard a man say every day and mean it like that." A man who'd buried his wife 5 years ago said, "I cried in my car after hearing it. Not because it was sad, but because someone finally said out loud what I felt but couldn't speak." Then it reached wider. News outlets picked it up, but not in the usual tabloid way. They didn't sensationalize it. They quoted his words exactly every day, and they let that stand. No added drama, no speculation, just the truth as it was spoken. Therapists started mentioning the episode in sessions. One counselor said a client who hadn't spoken about his son's suicide in 3 years finally opened up after hearing Keanu talk about carrying grief without shame. School counselors played short, edited segments for teens struggling with loss, showing them that even someone admired by millions feels pain, and that's okay. Joe noticed it too. His inbox filled with messages, not the usual fan mail or criticism, but letters that read like confessions. People thanked him not for the question itself, but for how he held the space after it. "You didn't rush him," one person wrote. "You didn't make it about you. You just let him be human." That meant more to Joe than any viral moment ever could. But privately, Joe wrestled with it. He replayed the moment in his head again and again. Had he crossed a line? He'd asked the question gently, with care, but still, it was deeply personal. He knew Keanu hadn't talked about his daughter in public before. What if he regretted it? What if the attention hurt more than helped? A few days later, he got a text. Just a few words and thank you. It helped. No name, but he knew who it was from. That was all he needed. Still, he made a promise to himself. From then on, he'd ask fewer questions just because they were interesting, and more because they mattered. Meanwhile, something beautiful started happening offline. People began visiting Keanu's daughters and partners' graves, not to gawk, but to leave small tokens of solidarity. A single white rose, a handwritten note that said, "I'm holding you in my heart too." A child's drawing of a star with the words, "You're loved." The cemetery staff later said they'd never seen anything like it. Strangers showing up not for fame, but for connection. Online, a quiet movement grew. People started using the phrase every day as a kind of shorthand for enduring love. Not in a morbid way, but as a tribute. Someone would post a photo of their late father's favorite chair with the caption, "Every day." Another would share a sunset and write, "Wish you were here to see this." Every day. It became a gentle way to say, "I still carry you," without needing a long explanation. Mental health organizations saw a noticeable uptick in calls and messages after the episode aired. Not crisis calls, but people reaching out to say, "I've been holding this in for years. Can we talk?" Hotlines reported that many callers specifically mentioned the podcast as the reason they finally picked up the phone. One volunteer said, "It's like hearing someone say 'me too' gave them permission to breathe." What made it different from other viral moments was the tone. There was no outrage, no debates, no memes making fun, just a collective sigh of recognition. Like a room full of people who'd been whispering their pain in separate corners, suddenly realized they were all in the same room. Even in places you wouldn't expect, the ripple reached. In a veteran support group in Texas, a former soldier said the episode reminded him it was okay to miss his buddy who didn't make it home. In a high school in Ohio, a teacher played the segment, with permission, during a unit on empathy, and students wrote reflections that brought her to tears. One teenager wrote, "I thought strong people didn't cry. Now I know strong people just keep going even when they do." Joe started noticing it in his own life too. Friends who'd never talked about their losses began opening up. His barber, a quiet man in his 60s, paused while trimming his hair and said, "You know, I lost my boy when he was 6. Leukemia. Never told anyone outside my family." Joe just nodded and said, "I'm glad you told me." And in that simple exchange, something shifted between them. Less barber and client. More two humans who understood. Back in Los Angeles, Keanu kept living the way he always had. Quietly, kindly. He didn't give interviews about the podcast. He didn't post about it. But people who crossed his path noticed something. He seemed lighter, not because the grief was gone, but because he'd finally let someone else see it. And in doing so, he'd given others permission to do the same. One afternoon, he stopped by a children's hospital unannounced. As usual, he brought toys, books, and his full attention. But this time, a little girl undergoing treatment looked up at him and said, "My mommy's in heaven now." Keanu knelt beside her bed, looked her in the eyes, and said softly, "Mine too." And then he just sat with her, holding her hand while she cried. No advice, no fixing. Just presence. That's what the whole thing came down to, really. Not the question. Not the fame. But the simple, radical act of being there for someone in their pain, and letting them be there for you. Months later, at a film festival, someone asked Joe what he thought was the most important moment of his podcast career. He didn't hesitate. "When someone trusted me enough to say every day, and I trusted them enough to just listen." He didn't call it trauma. He didn't call it shocking. He called it human, and that's what stuck with people. In a world that often rewards loudness, performance, and perfection, this was the opposite. It was soft. It was real. It was two people choosing honesty over image, connection over content. The episode didn't break records for downloads. It didn't trend for weeks, but it lingered. Like a song you hear once and can't forget. Like a hand on your shoulder when you thought you were alone. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing isn't a grand gesture or a viral stunt. It's a simple question, asked with care, a quiet answer given with courage, and the space between them, filled not with noise, but with understanding. That's what changed things, not for one person, but for thousands. And it all started with 2 words. Every day. Life didn't stop after that conversation. The world kept turning, the sun kept rising, and Keanu Reeves kept showing up. Not as a symbol, not as a meme, not as the sad, nice guy, but as himself. He went back to his routines. Early mornings, long walks, fixing motorcycles in his garage, visiting friends who were sick, sending quiet checks to causes no one would ever link to him. He still avoided red carpets when he could, still gave up his seat on the subway, still tipped waiters double, not for show, but because he remembered what it was like to struggle. But something had shifted, not in how he lived, but in how people saw him. And more importantly, in how they saw themselves. Because that moment on the podcast hadn't just revealed his pain, it had reflected theirs back to them. People started noticing the quiet strength in their own lives. The single parent working 2 jobs who still reads bedtime stories. The nurse who holds a dying patient's hand even when it's not in her job description. The teenager who checks in on a lonely classmate. These weren't grand acts. They were small daily choices just like Keanu's. And now people saw them as heroic. He never made a big deal about any of it. When reporters tried to ask him about the podcast's impact, he'd just shrug and say, "I just answered a question." But those who knew him noticed a subtle change. He seemed more at peace, not because the grief was gone, he'd be the first to say it never leaves, but because he no longer carried it in silence. Sharing it hadn't erased the loss, but it had made the weight a little easier to bear, like finally putting down a heavy suitcase you've been dragging for years and realizing you don't have to carry it alone. In the months that followed, he started saying yes to things he usually avoided, not interviews, but real human moments. He visited a grief support group for parents who'd lost children. He didn't speak much. He just sat in the circle, listened, and when someone asked how he kept going, he said, "You don't have to keep going strong. You just have to keep going." Afterward, one woman said his presence alone made her feel less broken. "He didn't fix me," she said. "He just reminded me I'm still here, and that's enough." He also kept acting, but now with a different kind of depth. Directors noticed it. In his next film, there was a scene where his character stood at a grave in the rain. No dialogue, just stillness. The crew was silent, watching the monitor. One assistant director later said, "It wasn't acting, it was remembering." And maybe that's what made it so powerful. It wasn't performance, it was truth. Joe, too, carried the moment with him. He didn't bring it up often, but it changed how he approached conversations. He became more careful with questions, not less curious, but more respectful. He'd pause before asking something personal, not out of fear, but out of care. And when guests opened up, he gave them space, not pressure. Listeners noticed the shift. The podcast felt warmer, more human, less like a show, more like a living room where real talk happened. But the biggest change wasn't in either of them. It was in the people who heard that exchange. A high school teacher in Michigan started a kindness journal in her classroom after the episode. Every Friday, students wrote one thing they appreciated about someone else. At first, they rolled their eyes, but over time, the notes got longer, more personal. One kid wrote, "Thanks for sitting with me at lunch when I felt invisible." Another wrote, "You make me believe I matter." The teacher kept those journals for years. She said they reminded her why she taught. In a small town in Oregon, a man who'd lost his wife to cancer started a monthly coffee meetup for widowers. He called it Just Sit. No agenda, no therapy talk, just coffee, silence, and the unspoken understanding that they didn't have to explain why they were still sad 3, 5, 10 years later. He said the idea came to him after hearing Keanu say, "I'm just trying not to fall apart." Me too, he thought. And so he reached out. Even in unexpected places, the ripple spread. A tattoo artist in Chicago began offering free memorial tattoos for parents who'd lost children. Tiny stars. Birds in flight, the word always. He said he'd never considered it before. But after the podcast, he realized grief needed visible anchors sometimes. Not to show off pain, he explained, but to say, "This person mattered, and I still carry them." None of this was organized. There was no campaign, no hashtag movement, no nonprofit launched. It just happened, naturally, quietly, like seeds carried by the wind. Because real change rarely comes from grand declarations. It comes from one honest moment that makes someone else feel seen, and then they go on to see someone else. Keanu never claimed credit for any of it. If anything, he seemed surprised that people found meaning in his words. "I didn't say anything special," he told a friend once. "I just told the truth." But that's the thing about truth. It doesn't need to be special to be powerful. It just needs to be real. Years later, long after the podcast episode had faded from trending lists, people still brought it up, not as a piece of content, but as a turning point. A woman wrote online that she'd been planning to end her life the night she heard it. She'd been sitting in her car, engine running, when the episode came on. She listened to the whole thing. And when Keanu said every day, something in her shifted. Not because he had answers, but because he showed her that pain and hope could exist in the same breath. She turned off the engine, called a hotline, got help. She's still here today. That's the quiet legacy of that conversation. Not fame, not clicks, but lives quietly saved because someone dared to be honest about how hard it is to keep going, and how worth it still is. Keanu never stopped visiting the graves. He still goes even now. Sometimes he brings flowers. Sometimes just himself. He talks to them like they're right there, about the weather, A funny thing a stranger said, a new bike he's working on. He doesn't expect answers. He just keeps the connection alive. Because love doesn't end. It changes shape, but it doesn't disappear. And in his own way, he keeps honoring them by how he lives, by choosing kindness when it's easier to be cold, by showing up when others look away, by proving that you can carry deep sorrow and still offer light to the world. People used to wonder how someone so famous could stay so grounded. Now they understood. It wasn't about ignoring pain. It was about letting it teach you how to be human, how to listen, how to care, how to sit with someone in their darkness without trying to fix it, just to say, I'm here. That's what that simple question unlocked. Not trauma, but tenderness. Not a breakdown, but a bridge between one man's grief and the shared human experience of loss. Love and the courage to keep walking, and in the end, that's what matters most. Not the spotlight, not the headlines, but the quiet moments where we choose to be real with each other, where we say, this hurts, and someone says, I know, and that's enough. Keanu never asked to be a symbol. He never wanted to be a hero. He just wanted to live a life that honored the people he loved, and in doing so, he showed millions of others how to do the same. So the story doesn't end with a dramatic finish. It ends the way real life does, with small acts of courage, daily choices to be kind, and the understanding that even the deepest wounds can become places where light gets in. And every day, somewhere, someone hears those two words, every day, and feels a little less alone. And that's more than enough. There was never supposed to be a part 6. The story as it stood felt complete. 5 quiet movements that traced a path from silence to shared sorrow, to something like healing. But life doesn't always wrap up neatly. Sometimes, long after the cameras stop rolling and the headlines fade, the real work begins. And that's where this part starts, not with a bang, but with a whisper that kept echoing. Months turned into years. The podcast episode became one of those rare pieces of media that didn't vanish into the internet's endless scroll. Instead, it settled into people's lives like a well-worn book on a nightstand, something they returned to not for entertainment, but for comfort. Teachers played it in classrooms during lessons on empathy. Therapists referenced it in sessions. Parents who'd lost children listened to it on the anniversary of their child's birth, not to reopen wounds, but to feel witnessed. And Keanu? He kept living, not as a cautionary tale or a symbol of grief, but as a man who'd learned to carry his pain without letting it define him. He still showed up, on film sets, in hospital rooms, on subway platforms, always with the same quiet presence. But something subtle had changed in how he moved through the world. He seemed less burdened by the need to protect his privacy, not because he suddenly craved attention, but because he'd realized that sharing a piece of his truth had helped others breathe easier. So he let his guard down just a little. He started saying yes to things that aligned with that truth, not interviews about himself, but opportunities to support others. He quietly funded a grief counseling program for families who couldn't afford therapy. He didn't put his name on it. He just made sure it existed. When a young filmmaker reached out asking for advice on a short film about loss, Keanu didn't just reply. He met them for coffee, listened to their story, and offered gentle guidance. Don't make it pretty, he said. Make it real. That became his quiet mantra. Make it real. Meanwhile, Joe noticed something too. Listeners began writing in not just about their own pain, but about how they were trying to be kinder because of that conversation. A truck driver said he started checking in on his lonely neighbor after hearing Keanu talk about showing up. A college student began volunteering at a hospice, inspired by the idea that presence matters more than words. These weren't grand gestures. They were tiny rebellions against a world that often feels cold, and they all traced back in some small way to 2 men choosing honesty over performance. But the most unexpected ripple came from an unlikely place: schools. A middle school counselor in Colorado began using the phrase every day as a gentle check-in. Students who were struggling, whether from bullying, family issues, or just the weight of growing up, could write every day on a slip of paper and drop it in a box. No names, no explanations, just a signal. I'm carrying something heavy. The counselor would then reach out quietly, offering support. Over time, the box became a lifeline. Kids who'd never spoken up started asking for help. Teachers noticed fewer outbursts, more patience in the hallways. It wasn't magic. It was just one small way to say, you're not alone. Keanu never knew about the box. But if he had, he would have understood. Because that's what his words had become. Not a quote to be repeated, but a key that unlocked doors people had kept locked for years. Years later, at a film premiere in Toronto, a woman approached him. She didn't ask for a photo or an autograph. She just stood there for a moment, tears in her eyes, and said, "Thank you for saying every day. My son would have been 10 this year." Keanu didn't offer empty comfort. He looked her in the eyes, placed a hand gently on her arm, and said, "He's remembered." Then he walked away, not to escape, but to give her space to feel what she needed to feel. That moment wasn't captured on camera. It wasn't posted online. But it mattered. Deeply. Back home, Keanu continued his quiet rituals. He still visited the graves. He still fixed motorcycles. He still gave away more than he kept. But now, when strangers recognized him on the street, they didn't just ask for selfies. Sometimes they'd say, "You helped me through a hard time." And he'd always respond the same way, with a nod, a soft "I'm glad," and a look that said, "Me too." What people didn't see was how he carried their stories with him. After that premiere, he sat alone in his hotel room for a long time, thinking about the woman and her son. He didn't cry, but he felt that familiar ache, the one that never really goes away. And instead of pushing it down, he let it sit with him, because he'd learned that grief isn't the enemy, numbness is, denial is. But grief is love with nowhere to go. And if you honor it, it can become a compass, pointing you toward kindness, toward connection, toward life. Joe, too, carried the weight of that moment differently now. He no longer saw it as just a podcast episode. He saw it as a reminder that the most powerful questions aren't the clever ones, they're the ones asked with care. And the most powerful answers aren't the polished ones, they're the ones spoken from the heart, even when they tremble. In interviews, when asked about his most meaningful conversations, he always circled back to that one, not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. "We spend so much time trying to be impressive," he once said. But sometimes the bravest thing you can do is just be honest, and that honesty kept rippling. A few years after the episode aired, a nonprofit launched a nationwide campaign called Every Day, not in Keanu's name, but inspired by his words. It wasn't about fundraising. It was about connection. The idea was simple. Once a month, people would write a letter to someone who'd lost a loved one. No advice, no platitudes, just, "I'm thinking of you." Thousands signed up. Grandparents wrote to grieving parents. Teens wrote to classmates who'd lost siblings. Strangers wrote to strangers. The letters weren't shared online. They were private, sacred, and they reminded people that grief doesn't end, it just changes shape. And it's okay to keep loving someone who's gone. Keanu never endorsed the campaign. He didn't need to. His life was the endorsement. As time went on, the story stopped being about him and Joe. It became about all of us, about how we show up for each other in a world that often feels disconnected. It became a quiet call to slow down, to listen, to ask real questions, and to answer them honestly, even when it hurts. And in the end, that's the real legacy. Not the views, not the quotes, not the headlines, but the countless small moments where someone chose kindness because they remembered how it felt to be seen. Keanu never set out to change the world. He just tried to live a life that honored the people he loved. And in doing so, he reminded the rest of us that we can too. So this part doesn't end with a finale. It ends with an invitation to carry our grief gently, to offer our presence freely, and to remember that even in the darkest times, we're never truly alone, because somewhere, someone is saying every day, and somewhere else, someone is listening, and that's how healing begins.